Standing at the kitchen window, I watched my 40-year-old son Neville carry boxes of his girlfriend's belongings out of the car for the fourth time that morning. His back was bent under the weight, and his face wore an expression of resigned fatigue that I had known since his childhood. Back then, he carried his school backpack in exactly the same way when his classmates made him carry their textbooks. His shoulders slumped, his gaze fixed on the ground. My son had never learned to carry himself with dignity. At 40, he still looked like a boy who could be made to do anything if spoken to in a sufficiently confident tone. Gwendolyn Craig stood on the porch of my house, the very house where I had lived with my late wife for 37 years, and directed Neville where to place the cardboard boxes. She was wearing an expensive sand-colored coat, which she had obviously put on especially for this solemn moment. Her ripe, wheat-colored hair was neatly styled, her makeup flawless. At 42, she looked like a woman who was used to getting her way at any cost. Every gesture, every movement of her head was calculated to make an impression as the mistress of the house. Even her stance was not that of a guest, but of an owner finally coming into her inheritance. "Be careful with that box. It contains my mother's crystal," she said in the tone one usually uses with an inept mover. "And don't put it on the floor. Find a table or at least a chair. Can't you see a normal surface? My God, how can anyone be so clumsy?" Neville nodded obediently and carried the box into the living room, staggering slightly under its weight. I saw his shoulders tense as he passed the photograph of my late wife, Adara, on the mantelpiece. 2 years ago, when Adara died of lung cancer, Neville cried at her funeral and promised to visit me every week. The promise lasted 3 months until he met Gwendolyn at that damn cafe near his office. Since then, his visits had become rare, and our conversations strained and full of excuses. An elderly woman in a gray fur coat, which had obviously once been expensive, but now looked worn and frayed at the sleeves, got out of the second car, an old sedan with rusty door sills. Priscilla Craig, Gwendolyn's mother, was the kind of woman who spent her whole life waiting for someone else to solve her problems. At 68, she moved with the caution of someone accustomed to saving her energy for truly important things, such as bossing people around and complaining about her health. Her face was discontented, with deep wrinkles around her mouth that spoke of years of chronic irritation with the world around her. "Gwenny, dear, where is my room?" she asked, surveying the area with the air of a landlady assessing her new property. "I hope it's on the sunny side. You know how badly I sleep if the room is dark in the morning. And close to the bathroom, because I have problems with my legs. And don't forget my humidifier. Without it, my throat starts to hurt right away." "Of course, Mom. I've already thought of everything," replied Gwendolyn, turning to Neville, who was just taking another box out of the car, this time smaller but, judging by his face, no less heavy. "Neville, take Mom's things to the bedroom opposite the bathroom. That will be her room. And put them down carefully. Don't just throw them around. We're not porters or something." The bedroom opposite the bathroom, the very room where Adara had set up her sewing workshop, where she spent her evenings while I sat in the garage repairing the neighbor's electrical appliances, where she sewed Neville's prom suit, and where she lay during the last months of her life, when it became difficult for her to climb the stairs to our bedroom. In the corner of that room, her sewing machine still stood, covered with a white sheet. Next to the window was the armchair, where she sat knitting when she no longer had the strength to stand at the ironing board. Neville looked up at me through the window, and for a second something like shame flashed in his eyes. Perhaps he remembered how his mother had taught him to sew buttons in that same room, or how she had read him fairy tales when he was sick with chickenpox, or how she had ironed his shirts before important meetings, even long after he had moved out. But Gwendolyn immediately distracted him with a sharp cry. "And try not to drop anything. Antiques require delicate handling, not like all this old furniture standing here." My God, how can anyone live among such antiquities? It's like some kind of museum. I moved away from the window and poured myself some coffee from the pot I had put on the stove before dawn. At 73, I still got up at 5:30 in the morning, as I had done throughout my working life. 45 years as an electrical engineer at the Millsboro Power Company had taught me to get up early and follow a strict daily routine. Even after retiring 8 years ago, I couldn't retrain my internal clock. Idara always joked that I woke up even on weekends because somewhere in the city the power might go out and I needed to be ready to help. The coffee was strong, just the way Adara liked it. She always said that weak coffee was a compromise not worth making, unlike the compromises our son makes. I wonder if Gwendolyn knows that Neville wet his bed until he was 8 years old, and that it was Adara who patiently changed his sheets every night without scolding or shaming him. Or that he was afraid of the dark until he was a teenager, and his mother left a nightlight on in the hallway for him. The front door slammed, and all three entered the house. Gwendolyn surveyed the hallway with the expression of a real estate appraiser, estimating the value of a property and its potential for improvement. She walked down the hallway, peeking into the rooms as if inspecting a purchased property. "Something needs to be changed here," she said, more to herself than to the others. "This wallpaper is too dark, and the chandelier doesn't suit the style of the house at all. In fact, the entire interior needs a serious update. The parquet flooring should also be sanded down, or better yet, replaced with laminate. Modern design requires fresh solutions." Idara chose the chandelier 20 years ago. She made a special trip to an antique shop in a neighboring town and bargained for a discount because the chandelier had a small chip on one of the crystal pendants. The salesperson said it didn't affect the beauty, and Idara agreed with him. We were saving money on repairs after the roof leaked during the spring rains. Every item in this house had its own story, its own reason for being here. "Dad," Neville finally decided to speak to me, approaching the kitchen with hesitant steps, like a child who knows he is about to be scolded. "Shall we have coffee together? Let's discuss how best to organize everything. I think we should have a heart-to-heart talk like we used to." I looked at him over my cup. My only son, whom I taught to fix a bike and drive a car, who once dreamed of becoming an astronomer but became an accountant at an insurance company. A man who fears conflict so much that he is willing to give up his late mother's house for a peaceful life with a woman who sees him only as a convenient tool for achieving her goals. I could see in his eyes that he wanted my blessing for this move, as if his father's approval could justify what he was doing. "There's not much to discuss," I replied calmly. "The house is yours now, so you decide. You're a grown man, as I'm constantly reminded." "Yes, of course it's his," Gwendolyn interjected, entering the kitchen without knocking, as if she had lived here for years and wasn't just moving in at that very moment. "We're one family now. A big, friendly family that will take care of each other." Priscilla walked around the kitchen, opening cupboards and peering into the refrigerator as if she were taking inventory of her newly acquired property. She picked up plates, turned them over, checked the markings on the bottom, and grimaced. "Gwenny, this place needs a thorough cleaning, and the dishes are so old-fashioned, not at all suitable for a decent home. We brought our own dinnerware. We'll have to find a place for it. And this old junk can be thrown away or donated to charity. Why keep something that has already served its purpose?" The tableware set that Idar and I had bought one plate at a time when we were young and counted every dollar twice had suddenly become old-fashioned junk to be thrown away. Plates with delicate roses around the edge, which Idara loved so much and which we only took out on holidays. "Of course, Mom," Gwendolyn agreed, sitting down at the table without being invited and folding her hands in front of her, like a woman about to hold an important meeting. "Baxter, you don't mind if we redecorate a little, do you? After all, the house belongs to Neville, and we want to feel at home here. I hope you understand." She said it with a smile, but there was steel in her voice. I realized that this wasn't a move, but a takeover, a carefully planned operation to establish a new order. The question was rhetorical. They weren't interested in my opinion. "Do what you think is best," I replied, finishing my coffee. I put the cup in the sink and headed for the front door. I needed some fresh air and time to think about what was happening in my house, which in a couple of hours would no longer be mine. "Dad, where are you going?" Neville called after me, a note of concern in his voice, as if he were afraid to be left alone with his new landladies. "To Kinnan's for an hour. I promised to help him with the wiring in the basement." Kinnan Redgrave had lived in the house next door for 12 years. We became friends when he first moved to Millsboro and asked for help installing an electrical panel. A former math teacher, he had taken up carpentry in his retirement and often asked me to advise him on the electrical aspects of his home projects. Unlike my son, Kinhan wasn't afraid to speak his mind and call a spade a spade. You could talk to him directly without beating around the bush or diplomatic evasions. As I was leaving the house, I heard Gwendolyn say to Neville, "Your father seems strong for his age, But at his age, people can become a burden very quickly. It's good that we moved in time and can look after him. You understand what a responsibility that is. The door slammed behind me, cutting off the rest of the conversation about my becoming a burden who needed looking after. It all started a year and 4 months ago when Neville came to me with shining eyes and announced that he had met a special woman. Gwendolyn worked as an administrator at the medical center across from his office, and they had met in a cafe during their lunch break. Neville recounted how she had accidentally spilled coffee on his documents, how she had apologized and offered to pay for the dry cleaning of his suit. He was charmed by her thoughtfulness and how she listened to his stories about work. His voice sounded like someone who finally felt interesting and needed. Gwendolyn came to our house for the first time a month after they met. At the time, she struck me as a very pleasant woman, polite, smiling, and well-mannered. She brought homemade apple pie and a bouquet of chrysanthemums for Idara's grave. She said all the right things about how sorry she was that she hadn't met my wife when she was alive, and what a wonderful home we had created together. I thought then that Neville was lucky to have met a woman who understood the importance of family traditions. She was dressed modestly but tastefully, spoke softly, and didn't interrupt when I talked about Idara's work at the charity. But on my second visit, I noticed how carefully she was studying the surroundings. Her gaze lingered on the antique sideboard in the living room, on the paintings, on Idara's silver candlesticks. She picked up porcelain figurines, examined the marks on the bottom, ran her finger over the carvings on the wooden furniture. She asked questions about how old the house was, whether I was thinking of moving to a smaller apartment, whether it was difficult for me to manage such a large property on my own. The questions sounded sympathetic, but I detected something else in them, the evaluative tone of someone weighing up possibilities. It was the gaze of a buyer at an auction, not a guest in her fiancé's house. Neville didn't notice this. He was too happy to have finally found a woman who didn't run away after the first date, as had happened to him in recent years. At 38, my son was still unmarried, his relationships usually ending after a few months. Women told him he was too soft, indecisive, boring. Gwendolyn, on the contrary, praised his reliability and kindness, calling him a real man, the kind that is rare these days. She knew how to give compliments in such a way that Neville blossomed and was ready to do anything to keep her affection. By the 3rd month of their relationship, Neville's visits to me became more frequent, but now he did not come alone. Gwendolyn accompanied him every time, and I gradually realized that it was she who insisted on regular meetings. She told Neville that older people need attention, that it's not good to leave his father alone, that family ties are sacred. My son blossomed at these words, feeling like the caring son he always wanted to be, but never knew how to be. When she was alive, Idara often reproached him for not calling often enough, forgetting her birthday, and not taking an interest in our affairs. Now Gwendolyn was correcting his mistakes and turning him into a model son. During one of these visits, when Neville was fiddling with my old radio in the garage, which had started to wheeze and only pick up the local station, Gwendolyn stayed with me in the kitchen. We drank tea from my mother's set, and she suddenly asked if I had a will. The question sounded too natural, as if she had been preparing for this moment for a long time. "I'm sorry for asking such a personal question," she said, covering her cup with her palm and looking me straight in the eye. "But I'm so worried about Neville. He's your only son, and if something happens, men aren't used to dealing with documents and legal matters, and then there are problems with inheritance, courts, expenses." I replied that all my affairs were in order. The house was bequeathed to Neville, as it should be. Gwendolyn nodded with relief, but I noticed the tension leave her shoulders. She had clearly received the information she needed. Then she added that it was right that family property should pass to the children and not be squandered on unnecessary things. She paused, sipping her tea, and cautiously remarked that at my age, many people move into nursing homes or small apartments where they are looked after by professional caregivers. "Not that I think that's necessary for you," she hastily added, noticing the change in my expression. "You look great and can clearly take care of yourself. It's just that I've heard from colleagues at the medical center that sometimes older people feel lonely in big houses full of memories, especially after the loss of a spouse." Then I realized where she was going with this. Gwendolyn was probing, finding out my plans for the future and how attached I was to the house. She was smart enough not to press the issue directly, but persistent enough to return to the subject regularly. Every visit, she would mention a story about friends who had successfully sold their parents' house and bought an apartment closer to their children. Over the next few months, she worked with Neville, and I watched the process like an engineer watching a complex mechanism at work. She carefully but consistently convinced him that I needed help. She pointed out that I sometimes forgot to turn off the lights in my room, that my hands shook when I poured tea, that I had become slower walking up the stairs. None of this was true or was greatly exaggerated, but Neville believed her more than he believed his own eyes. She knew how to present the information in such a way that her son began to see me as a frail old man who needed constant care. "Dad is getting old," he said to me once when we were alone after dinner. "Gwendolyn is right that I need to take better care of you. I'm a bad son. I don't visit you often enough. Mom would be upset if she knew how little time I spend with you." The guilt worked flawlessly. Neville really didn't visit often. His job at the insurance company took up a lot of his time, and his own life demanded attention. His bachelor apartment, his hobbies, his rare dates, all of this seemed more important to him than visiting his father, until Gwendolyn began to explain to him what true family responsibility meant. Now he felt guilty for every missed call and every weekend spent away from me. She began to offer practical solutions, each time presenting them as caring for our well-being. "Maybe we should transfer the house to Neville's name now, so there won't be any problems with inheritance and taxes later. Maybe he should move in with me so he can look after his father and save on rent. Or conversely, should I find a cozy apartment in the city center, closer to hospitals and shops, where it would be more convenient to live at my age?" Neville tossed and turned between these options, but Gwendolyn patiently guided him to the right decision. Moving in with me was inconvenient for him, too far from work, and he didn't want to lose his bachelor freedom. Finding an apartment for me was also problematic. I categorically refused to move and responded to all offers by saying that I would live in this house until I died. There was only one option left: to transfer the house to Neville's name and then deal with the other issues as they arose. "It's just a formality," she assured him when I accidentally overheard their conversation in the living room. "On paper, the house will belong to you, but your father will continue to live there as before. But there won't be any problems with taxes and inheritance. And if we ever need to sell the house to provide my father with good care in his old age, we won't have to wait for the paperwork to be processed." 6 months ago, Neville finally decided to talk to me about it. He came on Sunday morning, clearly prepared for a serious conversation. Gwendolyn didn't come that day. Apparently, they decided it was better to discuss such matters without outsiders. Neville was nervous, stammering, starting to speak several times and then stopping mid-sentence. "Dad, I want to propose something to you," he finally began, nervously fingering his coffee cup and avoiding my gaze. "You see, I think it would be right for the house to officially belong to me. Not that anything would change in your life, of course not. It's just that from a legal standpoint, it would simplify many issues in the future." I listened to his explanations about taxes, inheritance, and other formalities, and I knew these weren't his words. Neville never understood legal details and didn't plan ahead. This was Gwendolyn's work, carefully prepared and rehearsed. Even his intonation wasn't his own, too confident for a man who had spent his whole life doubting every decision. "All right," I said finally, finishing my coffee. "If you think it's necessary, we'll transfer the house to your name." Neville was so surprised by my agreement that he was taken aback and almost dropped his cup. He was clearly preparing for a long persuasion and did not expect such an easy victory. Gwendolyn must have provided him with a whole arsenal of arguments in case I resisted. I understood that resistance was useless. If not now, then later she would get her way anyway. It was better to do it of my own free will than under pressure from circumstances or in a hospital ward. The re-registration process took 2 months. Gwendolyn personally supervised each stage, made sure that all the documents were filled out correctly, and pushed Neville when he was slow to go to the notary. She was surprisingly well-versed in legal procedures for someone who worked as an administrator at a medical center. She knew what documents to collect, which authorities to contact, and how much it would cost. It seemed as if she had already gone through a similar procedure. When everything was finalized, Gwendolyn began to hint at the next stage of her plan. Now that the house belonged to Neville, it would be logical for him to live in it. After all, what was the point of owning real estate and not using it? and I could find something more suitable for my age, a small apartment or a place in a nursing home where I would receive professional care. After the house documents were reissued and Gwendolyn began to talk openly about moving, I realized I needed a plan. Not a plan of resistance or persuasion. That would be useless against such a determined woman. I needed a plan of action that would allow me to maintain my dignity and not fall victim to someone else's ambitions. 45 years as an electrical engineer had taught me to think systematically and use available resources. My main resource was my knowledge of electrical engineering and understanding of how all the systems in the house worked. The house was built in 1987, and I was personally involved in the design and installation of all the electrical wiring. I knew the location of every wire, every switch, every outlet. Over the years of living in the house, I modernized the system more than once, added new lines, and installed additional circuit breakers in the panel. Gwendolyn and her mother didn't know about this. To them, I was just an elderly man who once worked for an energy company. They had no idea what knowledge and skills I possessed, what opportunities my understanding of the electrical systems in the house gave me. I started making the first modifications 3 months ago, when it became clear that Gwendolyn's move was a done deal. I worked at night when the neighbors were asleep, using a small flashlight instead of the main lighting. Years of experience allowed me to work in the dark, by touch, without making any unnecessary noise. I started in the basement, where the main electrical panel was located. I installed an additional system of relays and timers, which looked like ordinary additional equipment. Nothing suspicious to a non-specialist. The relay was set to turn on and off at random intervals, creating the appearance of spontaneous power failures. The system worked according to a complex algorithm that I developed based on the principles of random load distribution. I paid special attention to the kitchen, where Gwendolyn and her mother would spend most of their time. I laid an additional cable in the wall behind the refrigerator, which created weak electromagnetic interference. Nothing dangerous or noticeable, just enough to make the refrigerator work intermittently. The compressor would turn on and off incorrectly, creating extra noise and disrupting the temperature. In the living room where the large TV was located, I modified the outlet so that the voltage would fluctuate within acceptable limits. But at the upper limit, the TV would work, but the picture would periodically flicker and the sound would be distorted. Nothing critical, but annoying enough for people who are used to comfort. I equipped the bedroom opposite the bathroom, which Gwendolyn had intended for her mother, with particular care. In the wall behind the headboard, I installed a tiny vibration motor from an old cell phone, connected to a timer. The motor turned on for a few seconds every hour between 11 p.m. and 5 a.m., creating a barely audible vibration in the wall. It was impossible to pinpoint the source of the sound, but the constant, slight rattling prevented anyone from getting a good night's sleep. In the same room, I slightly changed the wiring of the light switch. Now the light bulb did not turn on immediately after pressing the switch, but with a delay of 2 to 3 seconds, and sometimes it was necessary to press the switch twice. It was a small thing, but when a person was tired or got up at night to go to the bathroom, such delays got on their nerves. The bathroom got its share of modifications. I installed an additional transformer in the wall, which created a weak magnetic field near the mirror. The field was so weak that it posed no danger, but it was enough to cause electrical appliances, hair dryers, electric shavers, radios, to malfunction. Sometimes they would turn on by themselves for a few seconds. Sometimes they would turn off for no apparent reason. I was particularly proud of the system I installed in the master bedroom, where Neville and Gwendolyn were going to live. I laid an additional wire in the wall that created a weak electromagnetic field. The field affected the metal elements of the bed, the mattress springs and frame, causing them to vibrate slightly. The vibration was so weak that it couldn't be felt during the day, but at night, when all sounds were amplified, it created a constant background noise that interfered with deep sleep. The most difficult part was working with the water supply system. I connected the electric water heaters through additional relays that periodically cut off the power supply to the heating elements. As a result, the water in the taps was sometimes hot, sometimes barely warm, and it was impossible to predict. A person taking a shower could suddenly find themselves under a stream of cold water. All the modifications looked like normal technical equipment. Any electrician called in for diagnostics would have seen a standard, albeit somewhat complicated, power supply system. Relays, transformers, additional circuit breakers, All of these are normal components that can be found in any modern home. The problem was that the system operated according to an algorithm that only I knew. Each device turned on and off according to its own schedule, but the overall effect created an atmosphere of constant discomfort. You could never be sure that the appliances would work properly. The refrigerator could start up in the middle of the night and wake everyone up with a loud hum. The TV could show a perfect picture in the morning and be distorted in the evening. Hot water could suddenly run out at the most inopportune moment. I spent weeks setting up the system so that the malfunctions would appear random. I studied the failure statistics of household appliances, calculated the intervals between malfunctions, and programmed the timers so that no one would suspect that there was any pattern to what was happening. Even an experienced electrician might have decided that the house was simply in an area with unstable power supply or that the old wiring was malfunctioning. The only thing that could give away my system was the central control panel, which I installed in the basement, in the far corner behind an old workbench. The console allowed me to turn any element of the system on and off, change operating intervals, and increase or decrease the effect. But only someone who knew where to look and understood what they were looking at could find it. I even provided for the possibility of temporarily disabling the entire system. If I ever suspected that the problems in the house were not accidental, I could return everything to normal with a single switch. The house would work perfectly again, and any complaints about malfunctions would seem far-fetched. I finished the final preparations just a week ago. I checked all the connections, tested every system, and made sure everything was working as intended. The house looked perfectly normal, but as soon as I pressed a few switches in the basement, it became a source of constant irritation for the people who lived there. I knew I was playing dirty, but Gwendolyn was also playing dirty when she manipulated Neville and kicked me out of my own house. The difference was that I used my professional knowledge and she used other people's weaknesses. Ultimately, we were both fighting for what we believed was our right. It's just that my methods were more sophisticated. Now that Gwendolyn and her mother were moving into the house, the system was ready to go. They were about to find out what it was like to live in a house where nothing worked as it should, where every day brought new minor annoyances, where it was impossible to relax and feel at home. I had no intention of causing them physical harm or creating dangerous situations. My goal was simpler: to make their life in my house so uncomfortable that they would want to leave on their own. Let them understand that not everything in this world can be obtained through cunning and manipulation. By noon, the cars had been unloaded, and Gwendolyn and Priscilla set about inspecting their new possessions. I watched from the kitchen as they walked through the rooms, discussing plans for rearranging the furniture and telling Neville where to put things. My son obediently carried boxes, suitcases, and bags, not even trying to participate in the decision-making process. He had become a free mover in his own home. Gwendolyn held a notebook in her hands and wrote something down, making a list of necessary changes. From time to time she would stop, look appraisingly at Idara's furniture, and shake her head with the expression of someone who sees hopelessly outdated things in front of them. "Neville, dear," she said to her son as he walked past with another box of dishes, "put this in the storage room for now. We haven't decided what to keep and what to throw away yet." Throw it away. The dinner service that Idara had collected one plate at a time had suddenly become rubbish to be thrown away. I finished my coffee and put the cup in the sink, trying not to show my emotions. Meanwhile, Priscilla was settling into Idara's room. She hung her dresses in the closet, where my late wife's clothes were still hanging, simply pushing them into a corner. She placed a multitude of jars of creams, bottles of medicine, and a photograph of a man in military uniform, apparently her late husband, on the dressing table. "Gwenny, where can I put my TV?" she called from the room. "And don't forget the extension cord. The outlet is far from the bed." "We'll figure it out, Mom," Gwendolyn replied and turned to me. "Baxter, can we add an outlet in Mom's room? She has a lot of medical equipment that needs to be plugged in. I could add an outlet. In fact, I could solve any electrical problem in this house faster and better than any electrician they could call. But I wasn't going to make their lives easier." "That's serious work," I replied. "You need to call a specialist and get permits." "I'm retired. I don't do that kind of thing." Gwendolyn shrugged her shoulders as if to say that old people are incapable of anything. She wrote something down in her notebook, probably a note about calling an electrician. Neville brought the last box from the car and stopped in the hallway, breathing heavily. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead, and his shirt stuck to his back. After 2 hours of heavy lifting, he looked exhausted. "We're done, I think," he said, wiping his forehead with his sleeve. "Now we can rest." Gwendolyn looked at him with slight irritation. "What rest, Neville? We still need to put everything in its place, decide what to do with the extra furniture, make a plan for the renovation. We have a lot of work ahead of us." She said we, but I understood that Neville would be doing most of the work. Gwendolyn was the kind of woman who knew how to get others to do the work without raising her voice or resorting to overt threats. "Mom, you take a rest," she added, turning to Priscilla. "Moving is stressful at your age. Lie down for a while, Neville and I will take care of everything." Priscilla nodded and headed for her room, but a minute later, a disgruntled voice came from inside. "Gwenny, something's wrong with the light switch. I'm pressing it, but the light won't come on." Gwendolyn glanced irritably at the ceiling and went to investigate. I heard her clicking the switch and discussing the problem with her mother. Finally, the light came on. Apparently, the delay I had programmed had kicked in. "That's strange," Gwendolyn said as she returned to the living room. "Neville, you have a problem with the electricity here. The switch is intermittent." Neville looked concerned. As the new owner of the house, he felt responsible for all the malfunctions. "I'll call an electrician next week," he promised. "The house is old. Probably some wiring has come loose." "I hope it's nothing serious," Gwendolyn sighed. "Otherwise, we'll have to replace all the wiring. That's a huge expense." I listened to their conversation in silence, sipping freshly brewed tea. The first swallow had flown. The system had started working, and they were already sensing the first signs that the house was not as simple as it seemed. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, they had finished the basic placement of their belongings. Boxes were everywhere. Furniture had been moved around, and the rooms had taken on a strange, temporary appearance. Gwendolyn was pleased with the work they had done and decided it was time to celebrate their housewarming. She walked into the living room, where I was sitting in my old armchair with a newspaper, and stopped in front of me with the look of someone about to make an important speech. "Baxter," she began in a tone that sounded like an official announcement, "I want to thank you for taking our move so easily. I know that for someone your age, any change is difficult." I put down the newspaper and looked at her. Her eyes showed the triumph of someone who had achieved a cherished goal. "Now this house belongs to Neville, and therefore to us," she continued, a note of steel in her voice. "We plan to live here happily ever after and create a real family atmosphere. But to do that, we need space and the opportunity to arrange everything to our own taste." Priscilla came out of her room and joined her daughter. Neville stood by the window with his head down, like a child who knows something bad is happening but can't stop it. "What are you trying to say?" I asked, even though I knew perfectly well where she was going with this. "I think you should find a new place to live," Gwendolyn said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Something more suitable for someone your age. A small apartment, or maybe a nice nursing home. Nowadays, there are very comfortable facilities with excellent care." "Mom's right," Priscilla added. "Older people should live among their peers, where they are cared for by professionals. Young people need to build their own lives." I got up from my chair and paced around the room, pretending to consider their proposal. In reality, I just wanted to enjoy the moment. They thought they were winning, that their plan had succeeded completely. They didn't know that the real game was just beginning. "I understand," I said finally. "Young families do need space to grow, and I don't want to be a burden." Gwendolyn beamed. She had clearly expected resistance, a scandal, pleas to stay. My calm agreement came as a pleasant surprise to her. "You see how easily everything can be resolved when people behave sensibly," she said. "We will, of course, help you with the move, find a suitable place, and arrange for your belongings to be transported." "That's very kind of you," I replied, "but I need time to think it over, to contact real estate agencies. It will take 2 or 3 weeks to find a suitable option." Of course," Gwendolyn agreed. "We're not rushing you. The main thing is that the issue has been resolved in principle." Neville finally looked up and looked at me. In his eyes, I saw a mixture of relief and shame. Relief that the awkward conversation had passed without scandal, and shame that he was allowing his father to be kicked out of his own home. "Dad, if you need anything, let me know," he muttered. "I'll help you with the move and the paperwork." "Thank you, son," I replied, "but I'm used to taking care of things myself." I went into the hall and put on my jacket. I wanted to take a walk, get some fresh air, and think about what had happened. I also wanted to check how the system I had installed was working. Until evening, I had time to quietly observe the new owners from a distance. "Are you going somewhere?" Gwendolyn asked. "To my neighbor Keenan's," I replied. "He promised to help with the shelves in the workshop. I'll be back for dinner." "Maybe you shouldn't rush back," she suggested with the same sweet smile. "Today is our first day in our new home, and I'd like to spend it with the family from which I had been delicately excluded." I nodded and opened the door. "As you wish. See you tomorrow morning." As I left the house, I heard Gwendolyn say to Priscilla, "Well, it's easier than we thought. The main thing is to find the right approach to people." The door closed behind me, and I walked down the path to the gate. In my pocket, I had a small remote control disguised as car keys. Pressing an inconspicuous button, I activated the first phase of the system. Now the house that Gwendolyn considered hers would begin to show its true colors. We'll see how long her celebration lasts when she realizes that she has received not a gift, but a headache. I walked to Keenan's house, whistling a tune that Adara often hummed. An interesting evening of watching the new owners get acquainted with their property awaited me. Gwendolyn and her family spent their first night in their new home restlessly, although at first everything seemed normal. After dinner, they settled into their rooms, discussing plans for the next day and dividing up responsibilities for further settling in. Neville went to bed in the master bedroom with Gwendolyn. Priscilla settled into the room opposite the bathroom, and I, as promised, stayed with Keenan until late in the evening. Around 11 o'clock at night, when the house was quiet, the system started working. The first thing to turn on was the refrigerator in the kitchen. The compressor started with an unusually loud hum that echoed throughout the first floor. The sound was not critical, but it was noticeable enough to wake up light sleepers. Half an hour later, the humming stopped, but by that time sleep had already been disturbed. At 2 in the morning, the system in the master bedroom began to work. A weak electromagnetic field caused the metal springs of the mattress to vibrate slightly. The vibration was transmitted to the bed frame, creating a quiet but constant rattling that could not be precisely localized. Gwendolyn woke up several times, listening to the strange sounds, but every time she tried to identify them, they seemed to disappear. Priscilla had the worst of it. The vibration motor in the wall behind her headboard turned on precisely on schedule, every hour for 30 seconds. The sound was so quiet that it could be mistaken for the creaking of old wood or noise in the pipes. But it invariably woke the elderly woman, who was already a light sleeper. By morning, she was exhausted and irritable. When the family gathered in the kitchen for breakfast, everyone looked sleep-deprived. Priscilla was the first to complain about the strange noises. "Gwenny, there's something wrong with this house," she said, rubbing her temples. "There were rustling and creaking noises all night. Either we have mice, or the house is settling." "Mom, don't dramatize it," replied Gwendolyn, although she herself looked tired. "We're just not used to the new place. We'll adapt in a few days." Neville remained silent, concentrating on spreading butter on his bread. He had also slept poorly, but didn't want to complain on his first day. It was embarrassing for a man to admit that he was disturbed by noises in his own home. Attempts to make a normal breakfast brought new disappointments. When Gwendolyn opened the refrigerator, she found that the milk had soured, even though it was still within its expiration date. The butter had become too soft, as if the refrigerator had been malfunctioning all night. The eggs, which had been fresh yesterday, smelled suspicious. "Neville, there's something wrong with the refrigerator," Gwendolyn said as she threw out the spoiled food. "Check to see if someone set the temperature wrong." Neville turned the temperature control knob, but it was in the normal position. The refrigerator was running and humming as usual, but the results of its work left much to be desired. "Strange," he muttered. "Everything was fine yesterday. Maybe something got messed up in the settings during the move?" After breakfast, the problems continued. Priscilla went to the bathroom and tried to turn on the hairdryer, but it worked intermittently, sometimes at full power, sometimes suddenly silent. Neville's electric razor behaved just as unpredictably. The radio in the bathroom turned on by itself when no one was around and played at full volume, startling Priscilla. "Something strange is going on in this house," said the old woman, coming out of the bathroom pale and agitated. "The appliances are turning on by themselves, like in a horror movie." Gwendolyn tried to remain calm, but I could see her eyelid twitching, a sure sign of nervousness. She began methodically checking all the electrical appliances in the house, turning them on and off, trying to find a pattern in the malfunctions. The TV in the living room was working fine in the morning, but by lunchtime the picture began to flicker and the sound became distorted. Neville fiddled with the settings and checked the cable, but nothing helped. The TV was working, but it was unpleasant to watch. The second day brought new problems. The system went into full working mode, and the glitches became more frequent and varied. In the morning, Gwendolyn tried to take a shower, but the hot water suddenly turned cold when she lathered her hair. She had to quickly rinse the shampoo off with ice-cold water, cursing and shivering from the cold. Priscilla complained that the light switch in her room was intermittent. Sometimes she had to press it 3 or 4 times before the light came on. At night, when she got up to use the bathroom, it was especially annoying. She had to click the switch repeatedly in the dark, trying to turn on the light. "Gwenny, I can't sleep in this room anymore," she complained at lunch. "There are constant noises, and now the light won't turn on. Maybe I should move to the living room and sleep on the sofa?" "Mom, don't be silly," Gwendolyn replied irritably. "These are temporary inconveniences. Neville will call an electrician, and everything will be fixed." But Neville delayed calling an electrician, hoping that the problems would resolve themselves. He didn't want to spend money in the first few days after the move, especially if the malfunctions turned out to be serious and expensive to fix. By the evening of the second day, everyone's nerves were on edge. The refrigerator continued to spoil food, despite all attempts to adjust the temperature. The bathroom became a source of constant stress. No one could be sure that the hot water would not run out at the most inopportune moment. The worst thing was that the problems seemed random and unpredictable. Everything could work fine in the morning and then start malfunctioning in the evening. Sometimes the appliances would work perfectly for several hours in a row and then suddenly start malfunctioning. The third day was a turning point. At night, the refrigerator turned on every half hour, creating such a racket that it was impossible to sleep. Priscilla moved to the sofa in the living room, but she couldn't sleep there either. The TV periodically turned on by itself, flooding the room with bright light and the sounds of commercials. In the morning, Gwendolyn looked like a person on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Her eyes were red from insomnia, her hands were shaking from fatigue and caffeine. She tried to make breakfast, but the stove was working unevenly. One burner was too hot, the other barely warm. "Neville, call an electrician immediately," she said in a tone that brooked no argument. "I can't take this nightmare anymore. There isn't a single appliance in this house that works properly." Neville nodded and promised to call right after breakfast. He was beginning to realize that the problems were more serious than they had seemed at first. Living in a house where nothing worked properly was unbearable. At breakfast, Priscilla announced that she would no longer sleep in her room. "There's an evil spirit there," she said with the conviction of someone who had found the only reasonable explanation for what was happening. "The house doesn't want us. Maybe someone died here an unnatural death?" "Mom, stop with the mysticism," Gwendolyn replied wearily. "These are just ordinary technical malfunctions. Old wiring, poor power supply, worn-out appliances. Everything can be solved with money and good specialists." But deep down, Gwendolyn was beginning to doubt her confidence. Too many things were breaking at once, and even the most ordinary electrical appliances were behaving strangely. She was used to being in control, planning and predicting how events would unfold. The chaos that had descended on the house was throwing her off balance. After breakfast, she decided to conduct her own investigation. She methodically went through all the rooms, checked every outlet, every switch, every electrical appliance. But she couldn't find a systemic malfunction. Some things worked normally, some things malfunctioned, but there was no overall logic to it. What bothered her most was that the problem started immediately after the move. Yesterday, the house seemed perfectly fine, and now it had turned into a source of constant trouble. Had I really lived here for years without noticing all these malfunctions? Or did they appear just when new tenants moved into the house? By lunchtime, Gwendolyn began to suspect that what was happening was no accident. There were too many coincidences, too much good timing for all these breakdowns. But who could have set up such a system, and why? She remembered my calm reaction to the suggestion of moving out of the house. Most elderly people would have resisted, made a fuss, demanded to be left alone. But I agreed almost immediately, as if I was even glad to have the opportunity to move. Too calm, too compliant for someone who had to leave the house where he had lived for decades. By the fourth day of her stay at the house, Priscilla was finally convinced that the problems were not technical, but mystical in origin. She spent a sleepless night on the sofa in the living room, listening to every sound, and by morning she was ready to share her conclusions with her daughter. "Gwenny, I've been thinking about this a lot," she said at breakfast, stirring sugar into her tea with a trembling hand. "These aren't just breakdowns. There's bad energy in this house. Very bad. I can feel it with my whole body. Someone suffered here, died in agony." Gwendolyn sighed wearily. After another sleepless night, she wasn't ready to listen to her mother's theories about otherworldly forces. "Mom, please don't start with this nonsense. We live in the 21st century, not the Middle Ages. If there are technical problems, then we need technical solutions," but Priscilla insisted. She talked about how similar things had happened in her grandmother's old house after her grandfather's death, how the dead cannot rest if something is troubling them. According to her, the house was resisting the new tenants, trying to drive them out. "Maybe it's because we kicked old man Baxter out," she suggested, lowering her voice to a whisper. "Maybe his wife, who died here, doesn't want us to take her place." "Mom!" Gwendolyn cut her off sharply. "Enough of this nonsense. Idara died 2 years ago of cancer, not tragic love. And we didn't kick anyone out. Baxter agreed to move himself." Neville remained silent, poking at his eggs with his fork. His mother's remarks about dead wives hurt him more than he was willing to admit. Deep down, he felt guilty for allowing his father to be evicted from his family home. After breakfast, Gwendolyn finally decided to call an electrician. She found a company with good reviews online and arranged for a technician to visit in the afternoon. The cost of the call was considerable, but there was no alternative. It had become impossible to live in a house where nothing worked. The electrician arrived at exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon. He was a man in his 50s with tools and measuring instruments. Donald Crispin, as he introduced himself, had been working in this field for over 20 years and had seen all kinds of malfunctions. Gwendolyn explained the problems to him in detail. The refrigerator was not working properly. The appliances in the bathroom were turning on by themselves. There were interruptions in the hot water supply, and there were strange noises coming from the walls at night. Donald listened carefully and began his inspection. He started with the electrical panel in the basement. He went down with a flashlight and spent almost an hour there, checking the circuit breakers, measuring the voltage on different lines, and inspecting the connections. When he came back upstairs, he had a puzzled look on his face. "Strange," he said, wiping his hands with a rag. "The wiring is in good condition. The circuit breakers are working normally. The grounding is correct. Even too good for a house of this age. It's clear that someone has seriously modernized the system." Gwendolyn felt relieved. If the wiring was fine, then the problems weren't as serious as they seemed. "Then what's the matter?" she asked. "Why are all the appliances working erratically?" Donald shrugged and began checking each room separately. In the bathroom, he measured the voltage in the outlets, checked the circuit breakers, and inspected the wiring behind the mirror. Everything was within normal limits. In the kitchen, he spent a long time studying the refrigerator's connection, measuring the temperature inside, and listening to the compressor. At the time of the inspection, the refrigerator was working perfectly. It maintained the desired temperature and ran quietly and smoothly. "I don't see any problems," Donald stated. "Maybe there was a temporary power outage yesterday. Sometimes the power company does some work and the appliances start malfunctioning." Gwendolyn frowned. The problems had been going on for 4 days now, so it couldn't have been a temporary power outage. "What about the noises in the walls?" she asked. "At night, something is constantly creaking and rattling." Donald put his ear to the wall in Priscilla's bedroom, tapped it with his knuckles, and checked the sockets and switches. He found nothing suspicious. "The house is old, the wood is drying out, and the metal expands and contracts with temperature changes," he explained. "It's normal. In a month, you'll get used to it and stop noticing." Priscilla, who had been following the electrician around the whole time, shook her head. "Young man, I've lived for 68 years and I know the difference between normal sounds and something wrong. Everything here is wrong." Donald smiled politely, but it was clear that he thought the old woman was being overly cautious. He had had many clients like her, elderly people who heard signs of impending disaster in every creak. The inspection took 3 hours. Donald examined all the electrical wiring in the house, measured the voltage in all the outlets, and check the operation of every appliance. In his opinion, the electrical system was in excellent condition, and all the malfunctions Gwendolyn had described were either temporary or exaggerated. Perhaps it's a matter of adjustment, he said, gathering his tools. A new house, unfamiliar appliances, the stress of moving. People start to notice things they didn't pay attention to before. He wrote out a bill for his work and left, leaving the family confused. Gwendolyn had paid a lot of money, but the problem had not been solved. What's more, the authoritative opinion of the specialist cast doubt on her own observations. In the evening, the problems resumed with renewed vigor. It was as if the appliances had been waiting for the electrician to leave before starting to malfunction again. The refrigerator started up with such a roar that Neville woke up in the middle of the night. The hot water in the shower ran out just as Gwendolyn was lathering herself from head to toe. The TV in the living room turned on by itself at 3 in the morning and started showing commercials at full volume. "I don't understand what's going on," Gwendolyn said in the morning, rubbing her eyes red from insomnia. "The electrician says everything is fine, but we can't live normally for a single day." Neville suggested calling another specialist, but Gwendolyn doubted the advisability of new expenses. If the first electrician, who was experienced and qualified, couldn't find any problems, then the second one was unlikely to find any either. Meanwhile, Priscilla became increasingly convinced of the correctness of her mystical theory. She began to study the history of the house on the internet, looking for information about previous residents, trying to find out if there had been any tragic events there. "Gwenny, do you know how long Baxter's wife lived here?" she asked at lunch. "And how exactly did she die? Maybe she was suffering, unhappy with something." "Mom, stop digging into other people's pasts," Gwendolyn replied irritably. "Idara died of cancer, a natural death. There are no secrets or curses here." But Priscilla wouldn't let it go. She told stories from her childhood about houses with bad energy, about the spirits of the dead who couldn't rest in peace. According to her, it was necessary to perform a cleansing ritual or invite a priest to consecrate the house. Neville listened to these conversations with growing discomfort. He didn't like that Gwendolyn's mother was digging into his family's history, looking for some kind of dirt in his parents' past. But he didn't dare to object. After the move, relations in the house had become tense, and he was afraid of making the situation worse. By the end of the week, everyone's nerves were on edge. Constant lack of sleep, daily minor problems with appliances, and an atmosphere of uncertainty and anxiety created unbearable tension. Gwendolyn became irritable, lashing out at Neville over every little thing. Priscilla complained of feeling unwell and demanded to leave the cursed house immediately. "I can't live here anymore," she declared at dinner. "Every night these noises, every day new breakdowns. I've started having heart problems from the constant stress." Gwendolyn tried to calm her mother down, but she herself was close to a nervous breakdown. The house that was supposed to be her fortress had become a source of endless problems. She began to doubt the wisdom of her decision to move. Neville suggested calling another electrician or even completely rewiring the house. But Gwendolyn knew that would cost a fortune with no guarantee of success. The first specialist hadn't found any serious problems, so it couldn't be the wiring. "Maybe we should live somewhere else until we figure out what's going on," Neville suggested cautiously. "Rent an apartment for a month or two?" Gwendolyn looked at him indignantly. She wasn't going to give up and run away from her own home because of some technical problems. That would be an admission of defeat, and Gwendolyn wasn't used to losing. "We're staying," she said firmly. "We'll find the cause and fix it. We're not going to run away from our own home like frightened children." But deep down, she was already beginning to doubt her resolve. Living in a house where every day brought new problems was becoming unbearable. On the 10th day of their stay in the house, Neville finally decided to contact me. The situation was becoming critical. Priscilla was openly talking about moving back to her apartment, and Gwendolyn was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Constant technical problems, sleepless nights, and an atmosphere of tension had turned their dream home into a real nightmare. Neville called me in the morning while the women were still asleep after another sleepless night. His voice was tired, with a hint of despair. He beat around the bush for a long time, talking about the weather and his work, before he finally decided to bring up the main issue. "Dad, we're having problems with the house," he finally said, lowering his voice to a whisper. "Something's wrong with the electricity. The appliances are acting up, and there are strange noises at night. We already called an electrician, but he couldn't find anything wrong. I listened to his complaints sympathetically, asking clarifying questions from time to time. What kind of noises? When do they occur? Do all the appliances malfunction at the same time, or one after the other? Neville answered in detail, clearly hoping that my experience would help find a solution to the problem. Maybe you know something about the house? He asked hopefully. Weak spots in the wiring? Old sections that need to be updated? I paused, pretending to think about his question. In fact, I knew perfectly well the cause of all the problems, but I wasn't going to rush with my answer. You see, son, the house is quite old, I finally said. I've modernized a lot over the years, but there could be hidden problems. You need to look at everything carefully and understand the wiring diagrams. Could you come and take a look? Neville asked. You know the house better than anyone. Maybe you'll understand what's wrong right away. I paused again before answering. It was important not to appear too responsive. The people who had kicked me out of my own house did not deserve immediate assistance. I don't know, Neville, I sighed. I have a lot going on right now, settling into a new place, and it feels awkward. You wanted to live independently, without interference from your old man. There was a pause on the line. Neville clearly hadn't expected a refusal and didn't know how to react. Dad, please, he asked in an almost childish voice. We can't cope. Gwendolyn is on edge. Her mother is threatening to leave. If you don't help, I don't know what to do. I enjoyed his pleas, but I didn't show it. Neville had to understand that his father's help was not a given, but a privilege that had to be earned. All right, I said finally. I'll try to find some time next week, but I can't promise I'll be able to fix everything right away. Some problems require serious diagnosis. Neville thanked me happily and promised that they would try to be patient until my visit, but the residents' patience was running out. After talking to me, Neville tried to calm the women down by telling them about his father's upcoming visit, but the reaction was not what he had hoped for. Your father? Gwendolyn asked discontentedly. Why do we need him? We wanted to live independently without the constant presence of relatives. Neville explained that this was a temporary measure, that I knew the house better than anyone and would be able to quickly find the cause of the problems. But Gwendolyn was skeptical. If a professional electrician couldn't find anything, what can your father do? She asked. He's retired. Maybe he's not familiar with modern technology anymore. Priscilla, on the other hand, was relieved to hear the news. She was becoming increasingly convinced that the problems were related to Adara's spirit, and that the presence of her widower might appease her restless soul. Right, let him come, she said. Maybe his wife will calm down when she sees that he's back in the house. Gwendolyn rolled her eyes at her mother's latest mystical theory, but she didn't argue. The main thing was to solve the problems, and who did it wasn't so important. But the days passed, and I was in no hurry to visit. Every time Neville called and reminded me of our agreement, I found new excuses. Sometimes I had a meeting with a realtor about a new apartment. Sometimes I wasn't feeling well. Sometimes I had other urgent matters to attend to. Dad, we're really waiting for you, Neville said in an increasingly pleading tone. The situation is getting worse every day. And that was true. The system I had created worked flawlessly, creating more and more inconveniences for the residents. In addition to the constant technical problems, there were new troubles, internet outages, heating problems, and alarm malfunctions. Gwendolyn was becoming increasingly irritable. She stopped taking care of her appearance, wore an old robe, and didn't put on makeup. Her eyes were red from constant lack of sleep, and stress wrinkles appeared on her face. The woman who had always looked impeccable was turning into an exhausted housewife. The worst thing for her was the problems with hot water. Every morning was a lottery. Would she be able to take a normal shower, or would she have to wash with cold water? Gwendolyn, accustomed to comfort, took these inconveniences as a personal insult. I can't live like this anymore, she said to Neville after another cold shower. This isn't a house, it's a cursed place. Maybe your mother is right about the bad energy. Neville tried to calm her down, promising that I would arrive soon and fix everything. But Gwendolyn was losing faith in the possibility of a solution. Meanwhile, Priscilla began packing her things. She announced that she was no longer willing to endure the torment of otherworldly forces and would return to her apartment, where at least she could sleep normally. Gwenny, I warned you from the beginning, she said, folding clothes into a suitcase. There's an evil force in this house, and it doesn't accept us. She should have listened to her mother's experience. Gwendolyn was torn between wanting to keep her mother and realizing that life in the house had indeed become unbearable. She had put too much effort into the moving plans to back down so easily, but every day brought new challenges. The critical moment came on the 14th day. During the night, the alarm went off. The house security system activated for no apparent reason and began blaring throughout the neighborhood. The neighbors began to complain, the police arrived, and she had to explain the situation and apologize for the disturbance. In the morning, Gwendolyn made a real scene with Neville. She shouted that she was no longer willing to put up with this torment, that the house had become a source of constant stress and humiliation. She demanded that all the problems be solved immediately or she would leave with her mother. "I didn't sign up for a life in a haunted house," she said, waving her arms. "You promised me a normal house, but it turned out to be some kind of horror museum." Neville tried to argue that the house was fine, that they just needed to fix some technical issues, but Gwendolyn wasn't listening. "Your father has been promising to come for 2 weeks and hasn't done anything," she continued. "Maybe he's stalling on purpose? Maybe he likes seeing us suffer in his house?" That hit home. Neville suddenly realized that his father's strange behavior, the constant excuses, the unwillingness to help, the indifference to the family's problems, might not be accidental. "Do you think Dad is somehow connected to these problems?" he asked uncertainly. "I'm not sure about anything anymore," Gwendolyn replied. "I only know one thing. If the situation doesn't change within a week, I'm packing my things and leaving." With or without her mother. Priscilla, who was listening to the conversation from the next room, loudly agreed with her daughter. She had almost finished packing and was just waiting for the right moment to leave the cursed house. Neville was left alone with his suspicions and fears. For the first time since the move, he began to doubt that everything that was happening was a coincidence. There were too many strange coincidences, too many convenient timings for all the troubles. He remembered my calm reaction to the suggestion to move out of the house, my unwillingness to help solve problems, my constant excuses. Was my father capable of such a complex revenge? And if so, how was he doing it? That evening, Neville called me again. This time there was no trace of his usual pleading in his voice, only exhaustion and confusion. "Dad, we need to have a serious talk," he said without preamble. "Gwendolyn is threatening to leave if the problems aren't resolved within the next week. Are you really going to help us, or do you have other plans?" I heard the first notes of suspicion in his question. Neville was finally beginning to understand that what was happening might not be a coincidence. "Of course I want to help," I replied calmly. "I just need time to figure out this complicated situation." But time was working against the inhabitants of the house, and they knew it. On the 17th day of their stay in the house, Priscilla's patience finally ran out. The night was particularly difficult. The system was working at full capacity, creating a veritable concert of sounds and light effects. The refrigerator hummed like a tractor. The TV turned on every half hour, playing commercials at full volume, and the walls made sounds as if rats the size of cats were running inside them. By morning, the elderly woman was on the verge of hysteria. She came out of her room pale, her hands shaking and her eyes red from crying. The last straw was when she tried to take a shower. When she turned on the water, it was ice cold, then suddenly became scalding hot, then cold again. Priscilla ran out of the bathroom wrapped in a towel and screamed so loudly that the neighbors woke up. "That's it, I can't take it anymore," she shouted, waving her arms. "This isn't a house, it's hell. They're killing me bit by bit here." Gwendolyn tried to calm her mother down, but she was just as exhausted. 3 weeks of constant stress had turned a confident woman into a nervous wreck. She had lost weight, become gaunt, and had dark circles under her eyes. Her hands trembled from too much caffeine and too little sleep. "Mom, calm down," she said wearily. "Maybe Dad will finally come today and fix everything." "What Dad?" Priscilla squealed. "That old man is just messing with us. He's been promising to come for 2 weeks and hasn't shown up. He's deliberately delaying so we'll suffer." For the first time ever, Gwendolyn didn't argue with her mother. She herself was beginning to suspect that my slowness was not accidental. There were too many strange coincidences, too many developments that were convenient for me. Neville sat in the kitchen in front of his half-finished cup of coffee, and listened to his mother's cries with a stony face. He had changed a lot over the past few weeks. He had lost weight, aged, and his eyes had taken on the expression of a hunted man. He could no longer work normally, constantly thinking about problems at home and family conflicts. "Gwenny, I'm leaving today," Priscilla announced, wiping her tears with her robe sleeve. "I'm calling a taxi right now, picking up my things and moving into my apartment. At least I can sleep there." "Mom, wait, let's think this through." Gwendolyn tried to stop her, but her voice sounded unconvincing. "There's nothing to think about," Priscilla snapped. "Either you come with me or you stay in this damn place. But I'm not spending another night here." Gwendolyn looked at Neville, expecting him to say something in defense of the house to try to keep them there. But her son remained silent, staring into his cup. He understood that it was pointless to try to keep them by force, and he had run out of other arguments. After breakfast, Priscilla began packing. She threw clothes into suitcases, cursing and wailing. Every sound in the house, the creak of the floorboards, the click of a switch, the hum of the refrigerator, was perceived by her as a personal taunt. Gwendolyn walked around the house trying to make a decision. Leaving meant admitting defeat, giving up all her plans, losing the house she had put so much effort into. Staying meant continuing to live in a nightmare, not knowing when it would end or if it would end at all. The decisive moment came at lunchtime. Gwendolyn tried to heat up some soup in the microwave, but it sparked and shut down. When she opened the door, smoke billowed out, smelling of burnt plastic. That was the last straw. "That's it," she said quietly but firmly. "Neville, I'm packing my things. This house doesn't accept us, and I'm not going to fight it anymore." Neville looked up at her with tired eyes. "Gwendy, wait. Maybe we should try to fix the problem. We'll call in other specialists, replace all the wiring." "With what?" Gwendolyn laughed bitterly. "On your accountant's salary? Do you have any idea how much it costs to completely replace the electrical system in a house like this? And there's no guarantee it will help anyway." She was right, and Neville knew it. They didn't have the money for a major renovation, and it was impossible to continue living in constant stress. By evening, both women had finished packing. Priscilla called a taxi and was the first to leave the house, without even saying goodbye to Neville. She hurriedly carried out her suitcases, took one last frightened look at the windows of the house, and disappeared into the car. Gwendolyn stayed until dinner, trying to find a compromise until the last moment. She suggested that Neville sell the house and buy an apartment in the city, rent temporary accommodation until the problems were resolved, or even move into her old apartment. But Neville responded vaguely to all suggestions. "This is my parents' house," he said. "I spent my childhood here. My mother died here. I can't just sell it because of some technical problems." "Then live here alone," Gwendolyn replied wearily. "I can't take it anymore. My nerves can't handle this nightmare." She called a taxi for 8 o'clock in the evening. They spent the last hour in silence, sitting in the living room surrounded by boxes of belongings. The TV was turned off. No one wanted to risk provoking another malfunction. When the taxi arrived, Gwendolyn hugged Neville goodbye. "I'm sorry it turned out this way," she said. "I really wanted us to be happy in this house." "I understand," Neville replied. "Maybe when I solve my problems, you'll come back?" Gwendolyn shook her head. "I don't know, Neville. I honestly don't know." She left the house with 2 suitcases without looking back. The taxi took her away into the unknown, and Neville was left alone in the house that had seemed like a reward a month ago, but had now become a curse. He spent his first night alone on the sofa in the living room, afraid to go into the bedroom, where Gwendolyn's perfume still lingered. The house seemed huge and frightening. Every sound, every creak made him flinch and listen. In the morning, Neville finally called me. "Dad, they're gone," he said without preamble. "Gwendolyn and her mother. They couldn't take it." "I understand," I replied calmly. "I'm sorry it turned out that way." "Dad, do you really not know what's causing all these problems?" I heard the first notes of suspicion in his voice. Neville was finally beginning to understand that what was happening might not be accidental. "You know, son," I said after a pause, "I think it's time for me to come home. I'll see what I can do about these problems." You want to go back?" "Where else would I live?" I replied. "This is my home, the home where I spent the best years of my life with your mother." Neville was silent, digesting what he had heard. Probably for the first time in all this time, he understood the magnitude of what he had done by giving in to Gwendolyn's persuasion. Dad, I don't know what to say. You don't need to say anything, I replied. I'll come by in the evening and take a look at these mysterious malfunctions. I arrived at 7 in the evening, when it was already getting dark outside. Neville met me at the road and helped me carry a small bag of belongings. He looked exhausted, aged, guilty. The house greeted me with its familiar silence. There were no more women's voices, no more strangers' belongings, no more atmosphere of intrusion. Just my house, where everything was in its place, where every corner held memories of my life with Idara. Dad, what about the appliances? Neville asked as he watched me inspect the rooms. They're still malfunctioning. We'll see, I replied and went down to the basement to my control panel. With a flick of a switch, I disabled the entire jamming system. The house immediately became different. Quiet, calm, reliable. The refrigerator ran smoothly, the TV showed a clear picture, and hot water flowed steadily from the tap. Neville watched this transformation with surprise and growing understanding. Dad, he said quietly, did you arrange all this? I looked at him and nodded. Yes, son, it was me. But why? Why did you do this to us? I walked into the living room and sat down in my old armchair, where I used to read the newspaper in the evenings. And how did you treat me? I asked calmly. You kicked me out of my own house, where I had lived for more than 30 years, the house where my wife died. You decided that an old man should give way to the young and be grateful for the opportunity to live out his days in a nursing home. Neville lowered his head. He had no answer. I just showed you that I am the master of this house, I continued, and that getting my house through cunning and manipulation is not as easy as your Gwendolyn thought. We sat in silence for about an hour. The house was quiet and cozy, just as I remembered it. No strange noises, no technical glitches. Just a house where you could live peacefully and happily. What now, Dad? Neville finally asked. What do you think? I replied with a question. Neville paused, thinking about his answer. I think I did the wrong thing. I betrayed you for a woman who used me, and now I've lost everything. My home, you and her. You haven't lost your home, I said. It's still in your name. But the rest? Yes, you've lost the rest. Neville stayed the night, but in the morning he packed his things and left for his old apartment. He understood that it would be impossible to live with me after everything that had happened. Too many hurts, too deep a wound. And I stayed in my house alone. I put the photos of Idara back where Gwendolyn had put them in the storage room. I put her favorite cups on the table. I turned on the radio to the station we always listened to in the evenings. The house was mine again. And for the first time in many months, I felt at peace.